In the second half of 2020, Germany will assume the presidency of the Council of the European Union. The consequences of the coronavirus pandemic present Europe with an enormous challenge. Together, we want to work for Europe's recovery. How do we achieve this? By ensuring that Europe emerges from the crisis with greater solidarity and cohesion within, and more capable and sovereign abroad. We want to be even more united in all our diversity. What issues will be important in the future? We want to advance the European Union on strategically important issues like climate change, security, refugees and migration, the rule of law, and the digital transformation. We want to become even more innovative and sustainable in order to better overcome future challenges. The Presidency's cultural program is forward-looking. At its heart is the artwork Earth Speaker by Olafur Eliasson, in which Europe's children call on political leaders to listen. Based on our common values, we are committed to acting as a driving force and facilitator for a strong and capable Europe in the world.
We live in the age of artificial intelligence. AI is changing virtually every aspect of our lives, from how we work, to how we live, to how we communicate with each other. This comes with tremendous opportunities, but it also comes with significant risks for our fundamental rights. And it's high time to shed more light on that and to discuss it. That's what we're going to do today. Good morning from Berlin. My name is Janosch Delker, I'm a journalist, and I've spent the last several years covering artificial intelligence. And I'm happy to moderate this conference today, which is co-hosted by the German Federal Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection as part of the EU Council Presidency and the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, and in which we look at what the rise of AI means for our fundamental rights. What is it you can expect today? For the first time, we'll hear what the Fundamental Rights Agency found out when it interviewed over 100 European officials in both public administrations and private companies about how they already use AI to automate decisions. In 3 panels, we'll dive deep into how exactly the public sector is using AI to automate decisions, how the private sector is doing so, and finally, what this should mean for laws governing artificial intelligence, including the European Union's upcoming legal framework for AI. And we'll hear from some of Europe's key political decision makers and other influential voices how they're planning to make sure that the rise of AI won't do lasting harm to our fundamental rights. But before we get started, a few housekeeping notes from my side. Our conference is translated into German, English, and French, and you can pick the language of your choice on the login page of the conference. At the same time, everything that's said today is being transcribed and translated into 6 different written languages in real time by a lecture translator developed by the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. You can find that option right below the video player. On the same page, you will also be able to submit questions to our panelists later today. To do that, you have to log in with the token you received via email on Friday. And already at this point, I would like to encourage you to do so. We really want to hear from you today, so fire away with your questions as soon as our debate starts. In case you were wondering who else is watching this conference, as of this morning, we had over 800 registrations from all across Europe and beyond. Here you can see a breakdown of who those are. As you can see, there's broad interest across the field, from governments to academia to the industry and civil society. And we will also hear from all of those fields during our conference today. Last but not least, I'm also excited that we have Gabriele Heinzel with us today, who is a graphic designer and who specializes in what she calls graphic recordings. Throughout the conference, Gabriele will listen to what's said and she will illustrate it in real time. Stay tuned for more. And now, without further ado, I'd like to give the virtual stage to the first co-host of today's conference, the German Federal Minister of Justice and Consumer Protection, Christine Lambrecht. Frau Ministerin.
Lieber
Michael O'Flaherty, Didier Reinders, ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers who are joining us from all of Europe today. Today you are dealing with one of the hot potatoes of European legal and consumer policy, namely the regulation of artificial intelligence. The EU Fundamental Rights Agency and my ministry, the Federal Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection, are co-hosting today's event. We would like to have met you in the context of a face-to-face meeting, but once again, social distancing remains the imperative of the day, and the only responsible decision that we can take in COVID times is to maintain that distance. So we've diverted today's events to the virtual sphere, but this should not stand in the way of a lively and fruitful discussion. I would like to thank all of you for enriching today's event with your expertise, your knowledge, your experience in your perspectives. Sharing these with us is a very valuable contribution, whether you are joining us as speakers, as panel participants, or members of the audience in the discussion. Artificial intelligence has long since become part of our everyday lives. More and more areas are being discovered for its application, and what it has to offer is impressive. Quite rightly, artificial intelligence is also being described, however, as a disruptive technology, breaking open rigid structures and routines. This provides a number of major opportunities, for example, for the more efficient use of resources, for social interactions and communication, for products and services which are tailored exactly to the needs of the consumer, and as digital tools that we can use to improve and expand our human capabilities. One application comes to mind, for example, is the use of artificial intelligence by doctors to reach more reliable cancer diagnosis. One thing is clear, we will need to take regulatory action to accompany these developments. Human beings cannot become reduced to mere objects of opaque algorithmic systems. Fundamental rights must remain the benchmark for shaping our technical and technological world. So it's a very welcome fact, I would say, that our co-host, the European Fundamental Rights Agency, has been shedding some light on artificial intelligence with its new report, Getting the Future Rights. This major study about the fundamental rights compliant use of artificial intelligence will be presented by the European Fundamental Rights Agency as part of today's event. I would like to thank Michael O'Flaherty, Director of the European Fundamental Rights Agency, and everybody who was involved in putting this study together for their hard work. The impetus provided by your study will flow into the practical work on setting the regulatory framework for artificial intelligence. There is a lot in motion in this regard. In February of this year, the European Commission presented its white paper on artificial intelligence, and for the spring, a legislative proposal has been announced for a horizontal risk-based legal framework for artificial intelligence that will take place under the banner of fundamental rights. One of the participants in today's conference is also Commissioner Didier Reinders, who I would also like to warmly welcome. He will be saying a few words afterwards, so I'm absolutely sure that we will be hearing more about the plans of the European Commission in this regard. Our joint aim in all our efforts is to find a European way for doing artificial intelligence, for defining pathways, and defining pathways is one of the important priorities of the German EU presidency in this regard. The conclusions on the Charter of Fundamental Rights that were adopted this year placed digital transformation at the centre of their focus. Finding a European way for artificial intelligence, well, this involves respecting privacy, respecting freedom of opinion and expression. It guarantees data protection and guarantees the right not to be discriminated against. It guarantees access to law, and the European way of doing AI takes the guarantees of the Charter of Fundamental Rights as its baseline. The use of artificial intelligence, making artificial intelligence more transparent in its prognoses and decisions, and making these more intelligible, is what characterises the European way of doing artificial intelligence. Using the potential of AI and protecting fundamental rights at the same time, these are not opposing goals. A responsible use of these technologies will only improve the uptake of these technologies in society and will improve the confidence of consumers. Clear rules ensure legal certainty, and this provides a substantial competitive advantage for Europe. We are working at all political levels to ensure a values-based, human-centric use of artificial intelligence for the common good, both at the national and supranational levels and in our international cooperation. We are also working within the framework of the Council of Europe and UNESCO to ensure that standards and rules for the use of artificial intelligence are developed that correspond to our shared values. Today, ladies and gentlemen, you will have the opportunity to listen and to take part in a number of panels discussing what a European way of doing artificial intelligence might look like. How can we effectively enforce binding fundamental rights standards? What are the specific requirements that we need with regard to AI systems in order to achieve this? How might a fundamental rights impact assessment look? How might our oversight over these systems look? With regard not only to the public sector but also to the private sector, because there are different challenges in each of these areas that a regulatory framework for artificial intelligence would have to address. I would like to wish you an exciting conference, some helpful insights and exciting discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, Germany's Council presidency of the European Union is drawing to a close. At the end of the year, we will pass on the baton to Portugal, so it's a particular pleasure to welcome Anabela Pedroso, State Secretary from the Portuguese Justice Ministry, who will be giving the closing remarks on today's conference. As a European Union, we're making one thing clear. We want to shape the European pathway for artificial intelligence together. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Lambrecht. And this brings us to the second co-host of today's conference, the Director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, Michael O'Flaherty. Good morning to Vienna. Mr. O'Flaherty, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Minister Lambrecht, Commissioner Renders, State Secretary, dear friends, thank you so much for joining us today. We greatly welcome that you're giving us your time. Personally, I also would like to thank most warmly the German presidency of the Council for the wonderful partnership for this event and for so many others over the past months. Dear friends, we're in the middle of a very critical period for artificial intelligence in Europe. We're well advanced on the pathway towards what I might call taming artificial intelligence. There's the upcoming EU regulation, and these months have been filled with debate, examination, critique, and analysis. Much of that debate is marked by a dialectic. On the one hand, artificial intelligence is a powerful force for good that can transform our worlds in a most positive manner, and what's more, it's here to stay. But on the other side of the dialectic, artificial intelligence poses great risks that need to be managed with extreme care and caution. Both the positive and the negative have been marked by our experience of COVID-19 and our responses to it. AI has played and is continuing to play a most positive role for the identification and the distribution of vaccine. But on the other hand, some applications of AI have been troublesome. Take, for example, the use of predictive AI techniques in the grading of students who couldn't attend physical examinations. Both the positive and the potentially risky sides of AI have been also demonstrated in specific individual technologies, such as contact tracing applications. Now, given this reality, the dialectic, if you will, of AI, I greatly welcome the extent to which the EU and member states, including Germany, have focused acute attention on the role of ethics, on the one hand, and human and fundamental rights on the other in the regulation, in the management of artificial intelligence. And that, of course, is where we come in. That is where the Fundamental Rights Agency has a role to play. Specifically with regard to AI, we have taken the human and fundamental rights map and we have applied it to the technologies within which artificial intelligence is applied so that we could test the applicability of human and fundamental rights with regard to the specific uses. And we've also identified the gaps in terms of where there needs to be a focus of attention to strengthen the human and fundamental rights oversight. And that, of course, is the research we're presenting today. It is highly applied, a socio-legal examination. We, as has already been mentioned by our moderator, focus on some specific use cases of artificial intelligence in the research we published today. We look at its application in both the private and the public sectors. We do an assessment of the fundamental rights sensitivities and sensibilities, and we identify the systemic actions that are needed to support fundamental rights compliance. For the research we'll present to you today, there are three fundamental underlying assumptions. The first of these is that AI is not magic. AI is not some technology beyond our comprehension, understanding, or control, somehow driven by machines. That simply is not the case. AI is human-made. It's human-fed, it's human-driven. Given that the human is at the very heart of the application and use of AI, then it makes sense to claim that the existing human and fundamental rights infrastructure is directly applicable. Indeed, we could apply here the adage we've used now for many years, that human rights is as binding online as offline. And third of these underlying assumptions, since human rights and fundamental rights are directly applicable to the sector and to the applications, then the duty of the state comes center. For sure, much of AI is driven by the private sector, but this cannot lead us to avoid the reality that ultimately the application of human rights for AI is a duty of the duty bearer in international human rights and fundamental rights law. Now, my colleagues will present the findings in just a moment. Allow me to conclude my words this morning with just seven very brief conclusions. And these are by nature of horizontal conclusions, which are applicable right across the diversity of the applications of AI. The first of these is that we learned from our some 100 interviews that the strongest perceived value of AI out there in industry is efficiency. Now that matters for our discussion because the strongest value is not efficacy, it's efficiency. It's in a sense about speed. And so this means mistakes can happen and we have to be very careful in monitoring the application. Secondly, in terms of monitoring the application for wrongs and for harms, we have to acknowledge that all of human rights is engaged, not just this right or that right, but the entire gamut of civil and political, social, economic, and cultural rights. Albeit for purposes of our study, we have concentrated on three clusters of rights: privacy rights, the application of non-discrimination guarantees, and the right of access to a remedy. The third of my 7 conclusions has to do with the fact that even though all human rights are engaged, there's very little awareness of this in the industry. At least in the private sector, we see a preoccupation with privacy. It's important, but it's not enough. A sense that really the only human right engaged is privacy. And when it comes to non-discrimination, we also saw what I might put frankly as a naivete in terms of the perceived neutrality of technology. Fourth, we conclude, drawing from analysis such as what I've just mentioned to you, that there's a need for mandatory risk assessment by the AI sector across all the applications, albeit the assessment of risk will vary very much according to the applications and the challenge they pose for human well-being. Fifth of my 7, We strongly recommend empowering the existing human and fundamental rights monitoring bodies, including at national level, to undertake the risk assessment, or at least to monitor the application of risk assessment. Here I'm referring to the important potential role of national human rights institutions, equality bodies, data protection authorities. Sixth, we believe it's critically important to do a better job of delivering remedies for violations of fundamental rights through the application of AI. This area is little developed for now, and to the extent that remedies are in place, they're difficult to access and indeed to negotiate. And let me recall here that access to remedies is not just about getting justice for the violation of all manner of rights. It itself is also a fundamental right. And then seventh and finally, friends, it's imperative for the delivery of all of the good outcomes that we ensure transparency in the application of artificial intelligence. We need to know the manner of its operation. We need to know the content of algorithms. We need explanations of the pathways to a decision on the part of automated process. And let me wrap up then, colleagues, by quoting Pope Francis. Just a few weeks ago, he spoke about artificial intelligence, and he said, and I quote, "AI can make a better world possible if it is tied to the common good." We at the Fundamental Rights Agency believe strongly that that thread, that tie between AI and the common good is, at least in large part, the application of human and fundamental rights. And it's our challenge going forward to make sure that we bring that application, that use to life. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael O'Flaherty, the Director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. Mr. O'Flaherty, when the German Federal Minister of Justice and Consumer Protection spoke right before you, she issued a warning. She said, and I quote her here, "It's key to make sure that human beings are not being degraded to objects of opaque algorithmic systems." I'm wondering, if we look at the findings of your report, about which we will hear much more in a little bit, isn't that already the reality today? I mean, aren't we already kind of objects of these opaque algorithmic systems?
Thank you. Well, indeed, the minister spoke in the conditional. She didn't say that we are already at that point, but we have to be very careful to avoid reaching that point. And I would suggest that rather than already being in this dystopian world, we're intervening at exactly the right moment. This is a new industry. It's only just a few years old. We needed it to emerge. We needed its configurations to become apparent. We needed to get an assessment of its impact for human well-being. And only then could we engage from a regulatory and a human rights point of view. The intervention from a human rights point of view also is, I would say, going rather well here in Europe. We moved quickly from a discussion of ethics, which is voluntary and is about a sense of moral goodness, to the language of rights and of law, which I think, again, is a very natural progression. So I'm very optimistic. We have a lot to do. We could get it wrong, but we are more or less where we should be at the right moment.
And looking at these findings, because fundamental rights is something that affects each one of us, how worried should I be? How worried are you about your own fundamental rights based on the findings and based on what you heard from officials across Europe?
I'm worried that there's a risk if we don't move in a timely way. AI, as I said, has fantastic value, but real risk. I mean, and sometimes the industry isn't even aware of the risks, such as the insidious ways an application can be discriminatory. So we have to be very vigilant. We have to move very decisively. But I believe, as I said, today's conference marks a demonstration of the extent to which there is the political will to move. And I believe that Europe can and will set an example that can be valuably followed elsewhere in the world.
You said one key takeaway that you got from those interviews that you conducted is that AI is not magic. And you also, and I'm paraphrasing you here, but you also said later in your remarks that AI is not neutral, no matter what people tell you. What should that teach us for how we deal with artificial intelligence?
Well, it should teach us that human agency remains critically important. Ultimately, humans make the decisions about what's fed into AI, what AI is designed to deliver, what its impact is for other humans. And so we have to educate humans. We have to build awareness in the industry of the extent to which rights are engaged. We have to develop clear, straightforward tools for the application, but also for the citizen and for the impacted individual, so that they can seek redress where there's been a violation.
Looking at the overall findings of your survey and the report that you're publishing today, how much did it surprise you what you heard from officials across Europe and what you read sort of in the final concluded results?
Two things surprise me, and this is a very personal observation. The first is the extent to which AI is driven by the interest of speed and efficiency. It's about getting things done faster. I suppose I had a sense that that was a dimension of why we use it, but I had some sense also that it was about using the full power of computing to arrive at ultimately better outcomes. And that wasn't as visible, as strongly visible in the interview findings as I would have expected. And secondly, again, I'm not particularly surprised, but I'm struck by the extent to which those people who apply artificial intelligence are largely unaware of the human rights risks. Everybody's preoccupied about privacy. I think GDPR had its impact, but it's about so much more than that. It's about every imaginable human right. You know, the freedom of movement on the street where there's a camera watching me, you name it. And we have to build up a much deeper awareness of that. For sure, human rights is a technical tool, but it has to be understood in some manner by those people out there who are applying the technology.
Michael O'Flaherty, the Director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
And from Vienna, we are now going to Brussels for a keynote address by the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders. Commissioner Reynders, thank you for joining us, and the floor is all yours.
Good morning, and I want to say that to Minister Lambrecht and dear Christine and to dear Michael, that I'm very pleased to be with you this morning and to discuss with you about AI on the basis of such a very useful presentation by the Fundamental Rights Agency on the findings of their report. And ladies and gentlemen, I fully agree with the assessment of Christine Lambrecht that the potential for artificial intelligence is impressive. It will revolutionize the way we work, and we have seen that maybe more again during the COVID-19 crisis than before, improve productivity, drive innovation and efficiency. So it's very clear that we have a positive effect of AI. AI will help us to treat diseases, enhance the safety of transport, improve the competitiveness of industry, and make farming more sustainable. To give just some examples of the possibilities to use AI in the way to increase innovation, but also to increase the sustainability of our economy, and certainly when we will go out of the pandemic. But these opportunities could also come with some risks. There are questions on the role of humans in technological change, and we have to be mindful of the potential impact of fundamental rights. We also need to recognize that respecting our fundamental rights and values goes beyond protecting personal data and showing non-discrimination. It was said by Michael, it's very clear that it's possible to have some breach to many other fundamental rights than just the protection of the privacy or the non-discrimination in some fields. As the new report shows today, it is also about protecting consumers and even the way democracies work. When regulating AI, we must uphold our rights and values and our commitment to supporting business and industry. This was the aim of the Commission's white paper on AI published in February this year, just before or at the beginning of the pandemic in the European Union. By investing, coordinating research and fostering relevant skills, our goal is to help Europe pursue excellence in the area of AI. But to achieve excellence in AI, we need to develop trust. It's a key word in many fields, but certainly in AI. Trust is necessary for citizens to uptake this new technology. Trust will be created only by addressing citizens' concerns and fears, in particular as regard the respect of their rights. This commission made it a priority to develop a coordinated European approach on the human and ethical implications of artificial intelligence. This means that when developing and using AI in the European Union, complying with fundamental rights must be at the core of this approach, which we call the human-centric approach, quite the same that we have developed more than 2 years ago in the GDPR for the protection of personal data. I'm working together with my colleagues Margaret Vestager and Thierry Breton to shape this approach. Fundamental rights and the safety of AI applications are the two key objectives of the legislative proposal we will present in the spring of next year. As Commissioner for Justice and Consumers, it is my task to contribute to the AI proposal, ensuring that fundamental rights are fully protected in the digital age. I therefore welcome the report, Getting the Future Right, that the Fundamental Rights Agency is presenting today. This report could not have come at a better time. A thorough examination of the challenges that the use of AI can pose for people's rights and how we see the risks in different member states and in different contexts is of great value. I must say the work the Commission is doing on AI legislation is pioneering. Often, when preparing new legislation, we have decades of existing rules to look at and to evaluate. Not in this case. This makes the contribution from the FRA all the more relevant. We need good evidence. We need solid information and analysis. There is already a vivid debate on artificial intelligence, which addresses some of the challenges that AI brings. Much of the debate may be focusing on two key issues: challenges to privacy and non-discrimination. However, I'm happy to see that the FRA report has the foresight to include elements that are less frequently discussed, but not less important, like protecting consumer rights, access to justice, social security, or the right to good administration. We need to ensure that all these rights are protected where artificial intelligence is used. We must take a comprehensive approach that works horizontally. At the same time, we have the challenge of regulating a technology that is still in development, and we should not hamper innovation. Therefore, we need to be proportionate and take a risk-based approach. This requires a careful analysis of the sources for the risks analyzed by FRA and by others. One aspect that is particularly relevant in this regard is the opacity of certain AI systems. Where fundamental rights are at risk, we must be able to make sure that use of an application fully complies with the law. There must be a way to ascertain the legality of its use. This requires that supervisory authorities have the adequate means and expertise to fulfill their mandate where AI is used. They must be able to work together and join up their different domains of expertise. And they need something to work with. The white paper we presented this year addresses these challenges. And this is why the Commission is working on appropriate requirements for AI systems. They include documentation and testing requirements to detect biases that could lead to illegal discrimination, to give an example. We also need to be clear on what we are targeting. The field work of the FRA confirms that there is a large variety of systems that are called AI, with very different degree of complexity. We must work with a definition of AI and a scope for the legislation that allow us to address all the problems that we identify and that will stand the test of time. The field of application of the new legislation must be future-oriented. We do not want to create something that will be outdated tomorrow, especially in an area where technology evolves so quickly. This is why the risk-based approach we adopt is an advantage. It is clear that we are not just targeting a set of technologies. We are targeting the risks that arise when people use them in a certain way, and we are asking for the necessary safeguards to be in place. In this context, it is important to remember that the future legislation is not the only piece of the puzzle. The European Union already has a large body of rules for protecting fundamental rights, some of which is relevant for AI, such as data protection, privacy, non-discrimination, equality, consumer protection, and rules on the functioning of law enforcement authorities. This new legislation on AI will require us to ensure the effective enforcement of the rules that we have already in place. They provide a benchmark that still applies for developing new initiatives. It's the reason why it's so important to ask to the member states to implement all the different directives that we have at the EU level, and that the Commission continue to verify that there is a correct implementation and then a correct application of the new legislation. So the monitoring is also very important. Of course, as Commissioner for Justice, the right to an effective remedy is particularly close to my heart. If the use of AI causes harm, we have to ensure that victims are protected. Therefore, we need also effective liability rules for artificial intelligence. As the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said in her State of the Union speech, I quote, "There must be clear rules if something goes wrong." This is crucial to ensure citizens trust again in AI, but also trust in our justice systems. This means that some targeted adaptations to the existing civil liability rules may be necessary. The European Parliament has recently adopted a resolution with an overwhelming majority requesting the Commission to propose legislation on such adaptations. The Commission shares the Parliament's objective to ensure effective compensation for victims. We have launched a new strategy for the victims, a victim strategy of all crimes, but we need also to take care of the victims of possible use of AI in different ways, causing harm to the citizens. And following a public consultation, we'll decide on the necessary measures next year again. And we will maintain a close dialogue with the member states on this topic. To conclude these remarks, I want to thank the Fundamental Rights Agency again for such a report, which is an invaluable source of information to the Commission's work on shaping the future of AI in the EU. I also want to thank the German presidency of the Council of the European Union for our excellent cooperation. In particular, the presidency conclusions on the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the context of artificial intelligence and digital change in October 2020 underline that we share the same views on the challenges ahead. Our work together forms a strong basis for the discussions that I will continue with the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union. I look forward to fruitful work with the Portuguese presidency, and I'm keen to hear from State Secretary Anabela Pedroso from the Ministry of Justice how the Portuguese presidency sees the way forward on AI. And I want to say to Michael that, of course, it was very nice to receive such a report today, but it will be very important to continue to take part, of course, in the preparation of the new legislation, but then to monitor year after year the possible ways to detect different kinds of violations or possible violations of fundamental rights, because a sort of permanent monitoring will be very important in such a world where we have such a huge evolution in the use of AI. It's very nice that we will promote innovation and development of AI, but of course it's also very important to continue to monitor the situation year after year, and we will continue to work very closely on this in the near future. Thank you very much for this opportunity to say some words about the way we are working at the Commission level, and thanks for your discussions today. It will be a source of inspiration for the new legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Reinders. Commissioner, to understand the reality of on the ground, it's helpful to look at the report that the Fundamental Rights Agency is releasing today. The agency conducted over 100 interviews with officials across the European Union, and the findings suggest that in several European countries, administrations are already using AI systems to automate decisions over citizens, and some of those decisions have a deep impact on the personal life of individuals. Is that something that surprises you, and is it something that worries you?
Well, it's not surprising because, of course, we are knowing that there are some possibilities to use AI now in different processes. And it's maybe the most important element is that it's very important for the citizens or the consumers, but they are the same for a very large part. It's very important that the consumers and the citizens are knowing that they are subject to some different AI applications. And so it must be possible to give a very clear information about the fact that you are confronted with AI applications in the daily life. And it's the reason why we are very concerned about the situation where it's very difficult to understand what are the algorithms, what are the processes inside AI. And so the first element is to fight against opacity. And so it's the reason why I'm sure that we're on the basis of the different examples that we have seen, we need to have a risk-based analysis, I said, but we need to ask a real documentation. We need to ask testing requirements, but we need also to be sure that also if there is a sort of certification before the introduction of AI in some goods, to give example, in some products, in some services, it's very important to continue to organize a monitoring. And it's very important that the supervisory authorities and the judges at the end are able to understand what is it in the process, what is the process. Of course, the most important element is to inform the citizens and the consumers about the fact that they are confronted with such a kind of use of AI, but it must be also possible to organize a permanent access to the algorithms, to the content, to be sure that it's possible for the authorities to control and to receive maybe some claims, because if you don't know that you are confronted with AI, you don't have the capacity to react. So you need to be informed, and it's very important to fight against opacity, to don't have black boxes in the AI application. So it's not surprising, we are knowing, and we have put that in the white paper at the beginning of this year, but it's very important to, like it was done by the FRA, it's very important to explain to the citizens, the consumers, what are the concrete possible use of AI in their daily life.
You said it does not surprise you. Do you think people on the ground are aware of that? Do you think those people that are actually sort of the objects of those algorithmic systems know that this is happening?
But with the use of internet and the social media more and more, there is maybe a feeling that there is AI in many different ways. Of course, if you are searching something on internet and you are using the most famous engine to find a word or to find a reference, you know that there are some algorithms inside. But that is not the most difficult issue. The most difficult issue is that if you are confronted with a decision from a bank in the financial service, or you are confronted with a recruitment procedure, you need to know, is it an automatic system or is it at the end with a human being? And I must say, as Commissioner for Justice, it was one of my concerns, because we will invest more and more, and certainly with Germany and with all the member states, in the digitalization of justice. And it's very nice to do that, to have a better access to the case law, the documentation and so on. But is it possible to go so far that you are using AI to take the decision? I'm sure that at the end, you need to have a human being taking the decision in a trial. And that's very important. So again, in all the different elements, there's a feeling that it's possible to use AI, but maybe not in all the different applications. And that is very important to be sure that there's a better information to the citizens, the consumers, about the use of AI, about the possibility to contest the use of AI, and of course to us, to be able to fight against any breach to the fundamental rights. Because I said, in a recruitment procedure, or in a decision in the financial services, or in many other kind of automatic decision, it's possible to have a real discrimination and to have a real breach to one of another fundamental right.
Thank you very much, the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Before we go on, just a very quick note. Our lecture translator is currently overwhelmed by the number of visitors that we have. We're looking into this and we will get it running soon. And I mentioned it already a couple of times. For a new report, the Fundamental Rights Agency interviewed over 100 officials across Europe, both in the public and private sector, how they are already using AI to automate decisions. And now it's time to take a closer look at that.
How do we embrace progress while protecting our fundamental rights? Sometimes one moment is all it takes. 1 second when technology changes the world. Some of these changes are harder to spot, but they're happening now, all around us, on our streets, in our homes, in our pockets. Artificial intelligence is here, and with it, new possibilities we could never have dreamed of, as well as challenges to our fundamental rights we could never have imagined. We've already seen that our data is a global commodity and that an algorithm can have unforeseen consequences.
Prevent these tools from being used for harm.
But as artificial intelligence becomes an increasingly powerful tool, will it lead us to a golden age of progress and discovery, helping us to build a safe, healthy and equal world? Or will it affect our societies in ways we don't even fully understand? Are data used without oversight and without safeguards? How do we reap the benefits of a technological revolution while putting people first, building artificial intelligence in the service of our common values, without reinforcing our biases or revealing our deepest secrets? And as data-driven decision-making increasingly touches our daily lives, what does this mean for our fundamental rights? A step into the dark? Or the next giant leap? The time to answer these questions is here and now. Let's seize the opportunities, but understand the challenges. Let's make AI work for everyone in Europe. And get the future right.
Here it is, the new report. And in Vienna, we are now connected with the Fundamental Rights Agency and with its head of research and data unit, Joanna Goodey, as well as project manager, David Reichel, who will walk us through the key findings of their report. Joanna, David, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Janos. And we're going to present a PowerPoint of our findings to talk you through the research. I'm going to say a few words about the context in which we've conducted our research on artificial intelligence and fundamental rights before handing over to my colleague, David Reichel, who is the project manager who's responsible for the research and the report we're launching today. So first slide, please. So at the heart of what the Fundamental Rights Agency's report is about is the need for a rights-based approach to AI. Just at the beginning of December, the Fundamental Rights Agency on its own website has undertaken a mapping of the extent of different initiatives on AI and fundamental rights. And as I said, as of the beginning of December, we have over 350 different initiatives at EU member state level, and also some examples outside the EU. And these range from really soft law guidelines, drawing on ethics, towards suggestions from some member states that we need a hard law approach. So what we see is really a broad range of extensive policy developments on AI across the EU. And in recent years, a lot of these developments have focused very much on ethics. Ethics is, of course, central to a lot of the debate on AI and fundamental rights. But increasingly, in the last few years, there's been a shift in emphasis towards a rights-based approach. And that's very much what our report is calling for. Of course, industry and business have been very keen on having a soft, voluntary approach focusing on ethics. But of course, that doesn't safeguard people's rights. So we need to move towards a rights-based approach. And we see that happening in responses. Because, of course, fundamental and human rights are legal obligations. Ethics are typically voluntary. And with hard legal obligations, you can basically call on the rights that you as an EU citizen should be privy to. So next slide, please. Of course, we also call for the need for an evidence-based approach to fundamental rights and AI. The broad field of AI really goes from robotics through to deep learning. It has led to very generic and abstract discussions about AI that are not rooted in concrete examples. We see also very scattered knowledge and a lack of evidence on fundamental rights. And you heard that from the director of the Fundamental Rights Agency just a few minutes ago. When I say that, whilst there is very good knowledge that people have about specific examples of fundamental rights abuses, the example of how facial recognition technology typically is unable to identify, say, Black women's faces as opposed to white men's faces. These examples are very well known and are reported in the media. But when it comes to the full range of fundamental rights, there's a real lack of understanding and research on what it means in practice to implement fundamental rights and AI. We see this gap. So we need to focus on concrete use cases to avoid abstract, high-level discussions about fundamental rights as seemingly abstract principles, so that business and industry can drill down to say, what do you mean about fundamental rights? What does it mean in practice? And we can then refer to the broad extent of fundamental rights beyond data protection and beyond discrimination. Next slide, please. And finally, of course, we need evidence to inform policy on AI. And for our study, as you've already heard, provides insights into practices. We begin to do that because this study is part of a larger FRA project. We've published a number of focus papers that have dealt with AI and fundamental rights that talk about discrimination in big data and AI, talk about the quality of data, and talk about facial recognition technology as one example. This study is the starting point of FRA's work. Next year, we'll be doing research on bias in algorithms, looking at simulation case studies, and we will also be looking at online content moderation in relation to hate crime. So we begin with presenting this work today. So any future regulation of AI, concretely, needs to be evidence-based. Business and industry is really calling out to have this evidence-based. FRA was a member of the high-level expert group on AI that the Commission established, and it was clear that there was a lack of understanding of what fundamental rights means in practice. So we need fundamental rights safeguards embedded in any future law, and we need practical application examples. And that's where we talk about impact assessments. So very practical examples that business and industry can use. So I'll stop here and hand over to my colleague, David Reichel.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Let me kick off the presentation with a very brief overview of what we actually did in the field. We selected 5 EU member states, Estonia, Spain, Finland, France, and the Netherlands, and conducted 101 interviews, mainly with public administration and the private sector, about their use of artificial intelligence, their awareness of fundamental rights issues, and also the kind of tests they were doing before and during deploying AI. We also added 10 expert interviews among those engaged in fundamental rights discussions and AI at public authorities, but also in civil society and lawyers. We also added country research, including a mapping of policy developments and laws in these 5 countries, which are also available at our website. Next slide, please. So, of course, in the beginning, it's important to understand what we are talking about. What is AI? As most of you know, there is no accepted definition of artificial intelligence. We use the definition provided by the European Commission's high-level expert group on AI, on artificial intelligence, which defines it as systems that display intelligent behavior by analyzing their environment and taking actions with some degree of autonomy to achieve specific goals. This is obviously a very generic discussion, and also the high-level group started further developing this definition. But that's what we used when we went out in the field and asked people about their use. And the first result of the fieldwork was, in fact, that there are different views about what AI is and what it is not. Some people felt quite comfortable referring to AI when using relatively simple algorithms and automation processes, while others had really detailed views on certain machine learning algorithms being AI and others not. So this justifies even more to consider concrete use cases which are used in the field. Next slide, please. So in the report, we highlight use cases in certain areas, including the area of social welfare, for example, decisions about housing benefits or support to unemployed people. The area of marketing, targeted online advertising, the ads you see when browsing through the internet, but also targeted email campaigns. Also, we looked into the area of law enforcement, predictive policing about crime hotspots, for example, but also risk assessments in relation to domestic violence. We also looked into the important area of health services, where especially image analysis is used in relation to strokes or cancer detection, but also other use, such as monitoring vital statistics of patients in hospitals. Overall, across the different use cases, we saw that there's quite a difference as to the level of automation, the level of complexity, the impact on individuals, the possible harm if errors occur when using AI, and the impact on society in relation to the scale of its usage. Next slide, please. Let me highlight 3 examples of the use cases we found in the field. We present them here across the 2 dimensions of complexity, increasing from left to right, and automation, increasing from bottom to the top. When you look into the blue box, for example, relatively simple rule-based algorithms we found as one example in the area of social benefits, where there are clear if-then rules to decide about certain allowances. For example, your income falls below a certain threshold, then you're eligible for a certain allowance. This is partly automated. We also saw some fully automated decisions. But for example, in one case, if there's a certain level of discretion involved, then it was still a human to decide on that case. And when we then move from the left to the right, we see gradually increasing the complexity of the technology. In the white space, there's several issues in between, using rather traditional statistics, for example, regression analysis to decide on credit scores, then having relatively more modern machine learning algorithms, decision tree-based ones, such as random forests, getting a bit more complex, support vector machines, and then up to neural networks and all its variations. Let's look into the orange box at the bottom and to the right. This is based on an algorithm, deep learning algorithms, where several images are shown to the computer with a certain diagnosis attached. And based on this, the algorithm learns the rules that can lead to a certain diagnosis. However, it's at the bottom because it's still only a piece of information that is provided to the doctor, who then, taking more information into account, decides on the diagnosis in the use cases we interviewed. Now, let's move a little bit further to the right and also up when it comes to full automation. Especially the area of targeted advertising is the area among our use cases with the most fancy AI being used. Deep learning models, of course, to increase and how to increase the click-through rate for certain ads. But this was also the only area where an interviewee mentioned reinforcement learning, which is a technology that involves a certain level of trial and error to update and find the best rules to increase the revenue. Apart from automation and complexity, you can also see that the impact is different. Of course, a wrong diagnosis has a different impact on a human as if you see an irrelevant ad on your website. But again, the scale differs here, whereas there are millions of ads being processed every day. Next slide, please. That was also mentioned by our director in the morning. It was quite striking to hear almost everyone saying they use AI because it's more efficient. It's mostly used to save time, one of the interviewees mentioned. However, as we know, efficiency alone is not a justification enough to interfere with fundamental rights. Next slide, please. I know that most of those participating today know what fundamental rights are, but just give you a very quick overview. The fundamental rights framework is mainly, the main source of fundamental rights is the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. It just turned 20 years last Monday, and it's legally binding. It has the same legal value as the EU treaties for now more than 10 years. It is legally binding for the EU institutions and the bodies and the EU member states when acting within the scope of EU law. It is further safeguarded in secondary EU law, most notably data protection laws, non-discrimination laws, and many more. In addition, EU member states have also signed up and committed to being bound by international treaties. For example, the European Convention of Human Rights by the Council of Europe, which all EU member states have ratified. There are also global instruments on human rights, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from 1966. And finally, there are national and sector-specific laws which further safeguard fundamental rights. The awareness of fundamental rights among those we interviewed is relatively limited. It's not so much of a surprise because we also know in the general population, the Charter, for example, is not too well known. However, we found good knowledge in the area of data protection, but still some uncertainties, and general awareness on non-discrimination. Let me highlight a few rights now. Next slide, please. Data protection. Each and everyone we interviewed knew about data protection and could discuss at least some areas of it. It started the discussion by if personal data were used or not by their applications, which was not always entirely clear, and people remained relatively abstract when discussing the data they are using, speaking about open data, anonymized data, non-personal data, but also personal data and customer data. The topics that most often occurred in the discussions, in the interviews, were automated decision-making and the right to human review, as linked to Article 22 in the GDPR. However, we also found quite some uncertainty about the scope and the applicability of these provisions to the use of artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. A second important area, obviously, is equality and non-discrimination. One striking finding was the lack of in-depth analysis of non-discrimination when people were engaging in the use of artificial intelligence. Most of the interviewers were convinced that their systems surely do not discriminate. However, in some cases, this was linked to the belief that it's not discriminatory because they don't include information on protected characteristics like gender or age, for example. And those of you engaged in discussions on AI and fundamental rights are fully aware that this is not necessarily true, because there can be a lot of information in datasets that is highly correlated to some of protected characteristics. And lastly, important to mention, the rights of special groups were almost entirely absent in discussions. The rights of the child, the rights of older persons, or the rights of people with disabilities were rarely mentioned. So there's a clear need for further attention to these groups. Next slide, please. Another important area is access to justice, particularly access to an effective remedy. In general, those we interviewed were well aware that people have the right to complain when decisions were made with the support of AI. Usually they provided the normal available channels for lodging complaints, and only few were thinking about developing new channels, particularly for complaints about AI. But so far, not many complaints were received by companies or by public administration. And we don't know if this is linked to the more recent uptake of AI or the lack of awareness among those being subjected to decisions with the support of AI. Many interviewees highlight in this respect, when you complain about the use of AI, the importance of transparency and explainability, which is important to provide for the principle of equality of arms if someone is challenging decisions, but it also stems from the principle of good administration. Next slide, please. So in the report, we also highlight good administration principles for the use of AI in the public sector, consumer protection, particularly important for the private companies, and we also highlight social security in the systems. But it is really important to mention that there are many more fundamental rights impacted on depending on the use. For example, when discussing online content moderation, freedom of expression is relevant. The right to assembly and association if face recognition technology is used at public administrations. The right to education, as mentioned by our director before, automated grading, for example. The right to asylum. Border management authorities are also keen on using new technologies. The right to collective bargaining and action. Let's think about the gig economy and the algorithms used there. Or the right to fair and just working conditions when thinking about employer surveillance measures. Next slide, please. Because of the context, the importance of context when assessing fundamental rights, many stakeholders, including international organizations and civil society, have called for fundamental rights impact assessments. When discussing tests and assessments with those using AI, the focus was mainly on technical aspects. Some, of course, also focus and carry out data protection impact assessments, but rarely they take a more holistic and broader view and address other fundamental rights. In addition, those using AI were not always sure which bodies are responsible for overseeing their AI systems. Next slide, please. So for impact assessments, based on our research, we derive that at a minimum, the assessments should make sure and assess that data are processed legally. They should not lead to unfair treatment, and they should be contestable, which includes making people aware that AI is being used, inform people where and how they can complain, and make sure that decisions can be explained. Next slide, please. So to sum up, what does FRA say based on these findings? Obviously, the full scope of fundamental rights needs to be taken into account and going beyond the usual suspects of data protection and non-discrimination. The EU should consider making mandatory prior impact assessments that cover the full spectrum of fundamental rights. And in addition, it needs to ensure that an effective oversight and overall accountability is guaranteed, which also brings into the role of different existing bodies for the oversight of fundamental rights, just to mention data protection authorities and equality bodies. Next slide, please. And lastly, specific safeguards are needed to ensure non-discrimination when using AI. And given the lack of awareness about the potential for discrimination among those using AI, targeted research is much needed to increase the awareness of where and how discrimination can happen. We also need more guidance on how the existing data protection provisions apply to the use of artificial intelligence. And finally, to ensure an effective access to justice in cases involving AI-based decisions, one should consider introducing the legal duty for public administration and private companies to provide enough information to those seeking redress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, David. Those are fascinating insights, and I already have tons of questions. But before I ask you a question, I would like to encourage our audience to submit their questions. We have currently over 2,000 people viewing the stream. Pardon me. And I would really encourage you to submit your questions you have. Now is the moment. To do that, you have to log in on the conference page right next to the video player, and that will allow you to submit your questions. And now back to you, David and Joanna. Based on your findings and looking at the broader picture, what would you say? How much of a threat are we talking about? How worried should we be?
I'll start. Thank you. Yes, I mean, it was mentioned before, the use of AI has arrived. So obviously we have to be worried and we have to clearly look into potential implications. However, sometimes, I mean, we also see that the use and potential of AI is exaggerated, like the self-learning on the spot and things like this. And also, like was mentioned before, it is in fact not magic, but it is all human-made. But for sure, there are areas where it simply cannot be used for ethical reasons, for legal reasons, and also often for technical reasons. Not everything that we think we can predict can be predicted with the data we have. We also see some pseudoscience in this area, which I think is worrying. For example, people believing you can detect sexual orientation from the face of people, which is ethically, legally, and technically not correct in my view. So I think the biggest threat is, as we see now many people working on it and planning to take up new technologies, that it's simply blindly taking up and not taking into account several of the fundamental rights when designing the use. And then this way we can mitigate already several threats from the outside.
Thank you, David. Joanna, you said there's a scattered knowledge about fundamental rights. For example, one thing that you pointed out is that the knowledge about data protection is much bigger than the knowledge about the rights to a fair trial, for example. Why is that? How do you explain that?
Well, I think we can see, and I mentioned it also in the high-level expert group on AI, that business and industry, and as our study showed, are well aware of data protection. They're well aware to some extent of discrimination. But it's because law often is presented in a very abstract, principled way, and people need very, very concrete examples of what do you mean. And that also relates in the field of data protection. People are very aware of GDPR, but less aware of what we mean by applying it in specific cases where we use AI. And if we look beyond business and industry, I think the problem is not only in relation to the business and industry not being fully aware of the full scope and range of fundamental rights. In our own study, we did a reanalysis of Eurobarometer results, and they basically showed that some of the most socially marginalized in society and also older people are really very unaware compared with other sections in the population about how to opt out of direct marketing, for example. So when you ask me about why is it that awareness is low of certain rights, we also have to look beyond industry and business and say, well, a threat is also the fact that some of the most socially marginal are really less aware of how they can invoke their rights or what rights are at risk. So I think these are factors we also need to take into account. So not only very practical examples for business and industry, but letting the public know what their rights are.
Thank you. We have the first question from the audience. Francesca Palmiotto is asking, do you plan to expand this research also to other EU member states? Just to sort of like give the backdrop, you conducted your survey in 5 European countries. Francesca Palmiotto is asking, are you going to expand it to other countries as well?
Well, if I begin by answering that, is that we would love to expand it to other countries, but of course we're limited in what we can do as the Fundamental Rights Agency. And we would hope very much that member states take up the study themselves. So the evidence is there. Also, we have a whole section, a whole chapter dealing with how to begin to think about impact assessments. So we'd very much say it's over to the EU, it's over to the member states to really say, take the results of our study and try looking at them with respect to what's going on in your own member state about policy, law, and practical applications. And as I've mentioned, we have other studies where we're going to look at AI and fundamental rights, and we're going to focus on other member states. So not to worry, we're not only focusing on 5 member states, we're expanding our research to other member states in other areas.
Thank you. We have another question from Lorenzo Belenguer, who is asking, explainability is the elephant in the room. How can we tackle the black box problem in machine learning when the designers cannot explain how algorithms, which are becoming more complex and obscure, can reach a decision?
I can take that. I once heard heard a definition of the term algorithm, which can be defined as the term a developer uses when she or he doesn't want to say what they did. Of course, there are challenges in understanding complex and even the more complex technologies, but there is no way in preventing us to, first of all, describing what we did, what data did you use to train an algorithm, what algorithms were used. And even for the most complex tasks, there are now technologies available that can give you some hints of how you can explain. We interviewed, for example, in the companies, we also found different results where some companies said, we actually don't know how it works and how we arrive at certain decisions. But then other companies were saying, no, we have some tools available. Some said, in addition to the more complex technologies, we use rather simple ones that arrive at a similar accuracy and then at least give us some idea of how we arrived at certain decisions. But of course, some work lies ahead here, and also some of the companies clearly said, we need to invest more into the explainability of AI.
Mila Vidina has a question. She's asking, based on the Fundamental Rights Agency's recommendation, how can we best ensure contestability of AI-enabled outcomes if an AI breaches several rights at once?
If I begin by answering that question, what we need to do is look at existing bodies that exist at the level of the EU. So people are very familiar with data protection authorities, and that's the first point that people think about when they think about AI breaches, data protection. But in the EU, we have equality bodies, we have national human rights institutions, we have ombudspersons, we have consumer protection bodies. Now, all of these have their specific areas of expertise and knowledge. But what is really needed in the AI is a joined-up approach about how do we really deal with the full range of fundamental rights that can be impacted, because it's so clear that it goes beyond many of the areas that people are familiar with. But for that, we need to really invest in the expertise of these bodies, because it's clear from our interviews as well, is that there's a lack of knowledge and expertise there about the technical aspects. You might have very good lawyers in place, but you need to have the lawyers speaking to the technical experts and also speaking to civil society and academia about what do we actually mean about the application of AI and any fundamental rights threats and how to respond to them. You need redress mechanisms, which isn't just a voluntary, soft response. You also, worst case scenario, need to be able to, of course, access justice, and that might mean going to court in the worst case scenario.
Francesca Fanucci submitted a question that is actually referring to something that you brought up, David. She's asking, there seems to be general consensus over the need to conduct impact assessments throughout the life cycle of an AI tool. But who will conduct them in practice? And how far is the EU prepared to regulate those impact assessments?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the need to do impact assessment derives from the fact that the fundamental rights violations occur always in context. And this is why it's difficult to say you have to do this and that to ensure that fundamental rights are in line. We saw the lack of those using AI looking into potential impacts. So it's really important that those carrying out and deploying new technologies look into it from the outset. And if this is mandatory, then of course it's a clear added value. But as also mentioned by Joe before, we also need oversight. So also external oversight with respective expertise that can also look into the use of AI and ensure this application. The Commission is now looking into the policies and is clearly considering requirements also for those using AI. So we will see what the result is.
Ella Jakubowska is asking whether you, the Fundamental Rights Agency, are advocating for limitations on the most harmful use cases of artificial intelligence. In other words, are you saying there should be a red line somewhere for what's not okay to do as an AI system? Are you, and why are you or are you not?
Well, the Fundamental Rights Agency is not a standard-setting body. So really, some of these areas have to be left to the Commission and the Member States in terms of discussing those red lines. But I think what we've said, again, because what we're about is collecting the evidence on the ground beyond just the theory. So before any decisions are made, you need really good quality evidence to say this is a red line, this is an area you don't go into. I mean, we've published papers on facial recognition technology that people can look at, but what we do is we present the evidence, we underline some of the fundamental rights implications and challenges, but those red lines really are up to the Commission and the Member States themselves to draw. I'm afraid that's kind of an opt-out response from my side, but it's the reality, and it means that decisions should be made based on very robust evidence.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, David. I can already say that we will get back to the point of red lines later in the discussions. Thank you to both of you. And as we were speaking here, our very own conference illustrator, Gabriele Heinzel, has been documenting in real time what has been said in her very own way. Let's take a look. So we're seeing, like, right in the middle, someone asking, are you discriminating me? So this illustrates very well what we heard, that the issue of non-discrimination seems to be on people's minds. Gabriele has been including facial recognition. We're looking at equality and non-discrimination. And we see a robot who says, I learn your rules and make decisions. This is work in progress, and we will take another look later in the conference. And now the time has come for our first panel discussion. We heard it. There is little doubt that across the EU, administrations have begun using AI to automate decisions over citizens. And some of those decisions have a profound impact on the lives of individuals. That makes sense in some cases, but it also poses a significant threat to fundamental rights in others. So what do administrations need to keep in mind when they decide to use AI to automate decisions? And how can they make sure that this does not infringe upon the fundamental rights of individuals? That's what we're going to discuss in the coming hour. Let's get the future right, but how exactly? That's what we're here to discuss, and I am very happy that I have 5 panelists with me who will share their thoughts on the issue. Joining us from Amsterdam is Turia Miljani, the Deputy Mayor of Amsterdam, where she is responsible for the digital city. Also from the Netherlands, I'm happy to welcome Anton Ecker, who is an independent tech and privacy lawyer. Joining us here from Berlin is Matthias Spielkamp, the Executive Director of nonprofit Algorithm Watch. From the Free University in Brussels, we're joined by Mireille Hildebrand, who is a research professor on interfacing law and technology. And last but not least, in Brussels, we're joined by Olivier Onidi, the European Commission's Deputy Director General of the Directorate General Migration and Home Affairs, better known as DG Home. Good morning to all of you, and I would like to direct my first question to Turia Miljani. Turia, you're the Deputy Mayor of Amsterdam responsible for the digital city. Can you tell us, what does this role entail? And, can you also describe to us where the city that you're responsible for is already using artificial intelligence to automate decisions?
Thank you for the invitation. And giving me the opportunity to speak about the digital city. I've heard that I'm the first deputy mayor of the digital city. Before they called it the deputy mayor of IT. And the digital city is much more. And what I do is that I'm there to ensure that we live in a free, inclusive and creative digital city. So to make sure that the people of Amsterdam benefit from digital opportunities and that their digital rights are safeguarded at the same time. That also means that we experiment with new technology to learn about the possibilities or to see how we should not use them. One of the first examples that you have asked me for examples, and one of them is parking control. The first is the camera that are used in parking control. In many Dutch cities, including Amsterdam, parking attendants, they drive through the city in a car with a camera on top, and they scan all the license plates of parked cars. So an algorithm recognizes the license plates and checks a national database to see if parking fees have been paid. So if the algorithms say parking fees have not been paid, the picture is always double checked by a human attendant. Another example, and the second one, is our portal where citizens can notify us if issues we should solve, for instance, a broken trash can or faulty traffic lights. So that portal used to have dozens of categories for a citizen to choose from in order for the notification to reach the right department. That was, of course, very annoying for the citizens. But if they choose wrong, the complaint would also end up with the wrong department and would take longer to solve. Nowadays, we just ask citizens to write down their notification or complaint, and a text recognition algorithm recognizes to which category the report is likely to belong. And then the report automatically sends the right department. So the conclusion is there are just two examples how we use AI to improve our efficiency, but also the accessibility and experience of the city's services. So in each time we do use AI, we need to ask ourselves, does it help our citizens? And if it doesn't hurt their digital rights in any way. So both sides are important.
Thank you, Toria. And we're staying in the Netherlands with Anton Ecker. Anton, you're one of the lawyers behind a case that many people say could set legal precedent for how public administrations can use AI to automate decisions over its residents. Can you introduce the audience to that court case, and can you also tell us where it stands? I believe at the moment that your sound isn't working, Anton, so you might want to try to turn it on.
Does it work now?
It is working.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Great to have you with us.
Yes, thank you, Janesh. Good morning. Yes, I'm an independent tech and privacy lawyer. And starting in 2016, I assisted a group of privacy organizations from the Netherlands in bringing a case against this risk profiling system called Siri. Siri was used by the Dutch government to detect various forms of fraud, including social benefits, allowances, and taxes fraud. And for this purpose, data was collected from multiple government databases. And in this court case, we asked the District Court of Amsterdam to strike down the Siri Act, which is a piece of legislation that formed the basis for the data collection in Siri. So the court gave its judgment in February of 2020. The court decided that the Siri Act does not comply with the European Convention on Human Rights. Most importantly, the use of Siri was insufficiently transparent and verifiable. And Siri also contributed to stereotyping and bias toward specific groups in society, such as people with a lower socioeconomic status or an immigration background in certain neighborhoods. So after the judgment, the Dutch government decided not to appeal the case and to seize the use of Siri. So I think it's a very important judgment in that respect, although the Dutch government has already also introduced new legislation, which we will have to look at it. So the Siri judgment was the first decision in the EU on government use of an automated decision-making system. I think it sets a clear precedent for all national and local governments that want to use similar systems, and they should be aware of the risks of automated decisions. Thank you.
And we'll get back to that. And this brings us to Matthias Spielkamp here in Berlin with our beautiful Fernsehturm right behind him. Matthias, there's the use of AI by public administrations is a reality now. This is also something that's become clear by some of the work that your organization has been publishing. If we're looking at social welfare specifically now, the field that Anton Ecker just spoke about, would you say that technology should ever be used to automate decisions over residents, and if so, under which conditions?
To answer that question, I need to come back to this idea of automated decision-making, because it is important to understand that we are always only delegating decisions to machines. We are never really asking machines to make decisions because they can't. And it is a fundamental difference, because what we then take as a basis is that there are humans responsible for what is being done, and they need to be held responsible. And this, also then brings in the question of transparency and accountability and more, which have already been talked about today. So in general, I think it's difficult to say that in certain areas, such systems should never be used at all, because it always depends on the case. What I do think is, where I would go for a general statement is, if there is a lot of discretion, first of all, possible, and secondly, also needed to make a certain decision. Now, let's, for example, think about court judgments and things like that. Then it's rather hard to imagine that we would like to automate such decisions in the sense of delegating them to machines. I can not see, for example, a world, I don't want to see a world where, let's say, we have decisions made about humans, whether they whether they are sent to jail or not, that are delegated to machines. That is basically unthinkable. I mean, it's not unthinkable in the sense that people don't think about this and they develop tools to do this. I'd rather say that it should be unthinkable for us, because this is where we need to hold up the idea of human autonomy, and that it is us who would like to make this decision in the last instance. But then, when you look at tons of other cases where in social welfare as well, there can be automation used to also augment and improve human decision making, then I'd be a little humble and say, let's look at the cases themselves and not use general statements like in social welfare, there cannot be any such systems. I'd like to add one more thing though. What we always need to keep in mind is also when looking at these procedures and processes, there is a danger of outsourcing a lot of the infrastructure, the data, the decision-making capabilities by analytical systems to the private sector. And this sort of diminishes the, again, I use the word, the autonomy of the public sector itself to really have full control over those decisions. And that is a dangerous development that I think we should resist.
And, we'll get back to that later. I want to bring Mireille Hildebrand in Brussels into the discussion. So far, we've talked about the use of AI by public administrations to automate decisions over social welfare. But another field where we're seeing AI increasingly being deployed, and this is also something that becomes clear in the report, is predictive policing. So that's, analyzing vast amounts of data in order to identify and predict criminal activity. Looking at that field of predictive policing, would you say that law enforcement pays enough attention to fundamental rights when they decide to use AI for predictive policing?
Thank you very much for this question and for inviting me. First of all, I want to applaud the fact that this report, stating fundamental rights impact assessment, taking this out of the realm of ethics and voluntary concern about fundamental rights, and extending the scope of what we already have under data protection to more fundamental rights. Now, looking into the particular field of predictive policing, it may be interesting to look at a very recent report of St. Gallen University in Switzerland into the use of predictive analytics, predictive policing software in Switzerland, which claims to be a frontrunner there. Interestingly, one of the things that I think everybody will recognize is that this is not usually about AI. It's about something called software. And I would be very much in favor to stop using that word AI because it may limit the protection. So let's look at all kinds of software that either prepares decisions or makes decisions. Now, when you look at the research that was done in Switzerland, you see that if you put it very bluntly, this is about people being put on a list. These people are not aware that they're on the list, and they're put on that list with a risk score. And it turns out that especially if that risk score is high, it becomes very difficult for those using these risk scores to avoid them, not to apply them. So it is a human being who takes the decision. That's clear in all cases. But there is a kind of pseudo-legitimacy that comes from using the software. Now, there are two elements, there are a lot of elements, but I'm picking out two that make a difference between, on the one hand, predictive policing and other use in the administration of these systems. First of all, it is clear that policing requires a certain amount of opacity. That is clear compared to other systems, and we must realize that. That means you will often, if not always, not be aware that you're on these lists, and in that sense, you simply have no redress. The second thing is that while this is the case, at the same time, the impact of policing, especially when you move towards criminal justice, is much bigger. This is potentially about having your freedom revoked. When we then look at the impact on fundamental rights, there are, I think, two core fundamental rights that are at stake here. That is the presumption of innocence. The difficulty here is that it only begins to work once you are charged with a criminal offense. In the forefront of that, there's very little protection. Once again, you will not know you're on these lists. The second, which is very important, is the requirement of a reasonable suspicion that is normal within the criminal law realm. And we now see movements towards competences of the police in the case of a potentially reasonable suspicion or of a possible potentially reasonable suspicion. So you see an enormous amount of extra competences coming in. And on top of that, policing is not just about criminal justice, it's also about helping victims, it's about public order, and that's a realm where we must really look into the existing human rights, notably the presumption of innocence, and perhaps extends its protection. Last remark, of course, it's interesting to have fundamental rights impact assessment as a legal obligation. I think that's excellent. But then we also need fundamental rights protection by design. And I'm not saying that fundamental rights is an engineering problem. It is not. So I'm not arguing for fundamental rights by design. That's not possible. But protecting fundamental rights at the level of the architecture of the system is going to be extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireille. And from Switzerland, the study you referred to was from Switzerland. We're going back to the European Union and the European Commission and Olivier Onidi. We heard it from the Fundamental Rights Agency in their report. We also heard it in our panel discussion already. Law enforcement across the EU are now using AI for predictive policing. Is that something that you're monitoring? And how are you addressing this in your work as the European Commission?
Thank you for this opportunity and the question. I mean, we're not monitoring the use of predictive policing by law enforcement in the EU, but we're certainly interested in this, and we definitely discuss this and work with the law enforcement community of the EU in order to better understand the potential of predictive policing, and equally, of course, the necessary modernization of the overall legal framework that needs to be accompanied in order to entail this risk mitigation element that is very important since this is very much a new development in many ways. I think one important aspect is the fact that artificial intelligence, the use of software, Mireille is right. I mean, it's like any kind of computer tools is very important in the sense that today's security is very much dependent on the analysis of data. You hardly have a crime these days that doesn't entail a digital footprint. So it is about getting the right data, having the ability to analyze this data in order to actually conduct an investigation, and then using also that type of data into courts throughout the judiciary procedure. Second aspect is the fact that given the level of threat, given also the intensity of criminal activities, and given the fact that criminals are better and better in using technologies, including tools such as artificial intelligence, it is absolutely essential for the law enforcement community to also be equipped and have those tools. Why? Because first, it is the important aspect of trying to anticipate and prevent. So protecting is very good, but if you can use technology in order to prevent something from happening, this is, of course, adds an additional layer as to the type of security you can provide to your citizens. The second one is to be able, on the basis of the analysis that is being provided by this computer power, to actually focus and target your resources where they are needed. No law enforcement authority has actually the resources in order to cater for a risk-free, a crime-free society. So everything is there in order to use whatever tool is available, and computer tools are extremely precious, in order to really put the resources where it matters. Which areas, what type of crime will we experience, and sometimes also the individuals. Although there, it is, I think, for the moment, really the exception. The example of the Swiss example Mireille was talking about is something that is very, very rarely used. The third one is actually that predictive policing as such is something that exists for very long. It's just more interesting now because you use computers. You had big stories about companies helping New York Police Department in actually predicting a crime. There's not much in terms of predicting a possible crime, but it's much more how you can support the normal analytics and use this in order to support the decision maker of where to put the resources, what type of resources you put, and so on. So I would say it's not something dramatically new, but because this is something that is happening in the context of a society that is enhanced and increasingly a digital society, it necessitates bodies like the Fundamental Rights Agency and others to actually provide the policymakers with the right questions, with the right also analysis, so that the framework, the overall framework, is constantly modernized in order to avoid abuses. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. It's already become clear that there is more than enough to discuss, and that's also why we'd like to hear from you, the audience, in our first audience poll for today. We'd like to hear from you. The question we're asking you is, do you think some decisions in area of social welfare, which is the first field we talked about, should be automated? Yes, no, or I don't know. Do you think some decisions in the area of social welfare should be automated? Yes, no, or I don't know. And while we wait for the results, I'd like to pass the question on to Turia Meliani. You you described to us earlier how you use technology for a parking system, for example. But looking at the area of social welfare, what would you say? Do you think some decisions should be automated? And in concrete terms, in Amsterdam, where are you already using AI to automate decisions over your residents?
Well, you can do a lot of things automated, but like I said in the last...
Should you? Not what you can do, but what you should do.
No, I think it starts with the ethical framework. You can only do it if you have a framework. Then you should do it because it's practical, it's efficient, it's very efficient. But if there is no ethical framework, then you shouldn't do it. So it starts with that, and then you can do it.
Okay. Anton Ecker, someone who's in the same country as Turia, are you convinced? What do you think? Anton, I believe your sound isn't working again.
I apologize. Well, I remember when we were negotiating with the Ministry of Social Affairs about the Syria case, it was very apparent that the people there didn't realize what the problems were. So they were not informed. But maybe this has changed over the last years. But I think there's a huge need for governments, agencies to be more informed about the risks and to think before they act. I think that's a very important aspect.
Thank you. The results of our polls are in. So the question was, do you think some decisions in the area of social welfare should be automated? And we have a majority, small majority of 43% more or less saying yes, some decisions should be automated. We have around 35% saying no. And about a fifth of our respondents say they don't know. So it seems like there's no broad consensus on the issue. Before we go into the discussion, quick remarks before we started. To the panelists, please briefly just raise your hand whenever you want to add something or say something, and I will make sure to give you the floor. At the same time, I also really like to encourage everyone in the audience to submit their questions. You can do that on the website of the conference. To do that, you have to log in with the token that you received on Friday, right next to the video player. Please ideally submit your questions in English and also indicate who in particular you'd like to address on the panel. And now back to our debate. Mireille, you raised your hand. If I may ask you the question, looking at the results that we have, sort of like no consensus on whether or not to automate decisions, is that something that surprises you?
No, not at all. I think nothing would actually surprise me because it all depends on how people are informed, to what extent you have been a victim of a decision. I think it is extremely important that Social Security decision-making is as efficient as possible. So the back end of these systems, supporting the people making these decisions, should be automated as much as possible in the sense of clarifying things, giving people information. But I also think that, especially when you're talking about Social Security, nothing can be more important than interaction with people. I think a lot of the problems with these systems that have come out, not only in the Netherlands, but also in Sweden, in the UK, where you can clearly see in the news items that people have been flagged by machine learning systems that have an enormous amount of false positives and also false negatives. There are basically, and sorry to use that word, but they are basically very crappy systems. On top of that, they are proprietary, so you cannot put your finger behind it. So you're working with an unreliable system. One of the interesting things, to go back to the research in Switzerland, and it was not about things that are not happening in smart policing everywhere. One of the conclusions was that the civil servants working with those systems don't really understand them. So they don't have the competence to change the decisions, not really because they don't understand why the advice was given. And they've sort of become dependent upon them because if they do not follow the advice, they have an extra burden to explain why. I think all of that is problematic. What the report also said is that the assessment of these systems is basically done by the people who are selling them. Now, all this should be obvious. We need regulation, or I would say legislation. Legislation is a certain term that fits a certain discourse. I'm not interested in regulation. I'm interested in good legislation that requires an impact assessment, a very practical impact assessment that looks concretely in what may be the implications of using this system, of getting those who are going to suffer or enjoy the consequences into the room, having good discussions and repeating that impact assessment. And then figuring out, to the extent that it's really necessary to have these systems, because that's the requirement of fundamental rights. To the extent it's really necessary to have these systems, to then look at the research design decisions as deep as possible to sort of have this fundamental rights protection by design. And I'm really talking about very practical design decisions. So if you don't have the right data, then don't get on with your business with the low-hanging fruit.
I think those are fascinating points. I would like to pick up one point that you raised earlier and ask that question to Turia Meliani in Amsterdam, who will also have to leave us a little earlier. Turia, Mireille sort of said, I'm paraphrasing, the reality on the ground is also that a lot of these AI systems are manufactured by private companies, and the public officials who are using them don't fully understand them. This is also something that the Fundamental Rights Agency report that is published today illustrates. So how do you make sure in Amsterdam that your officials actually understand the technology that they're using? And how do you raise awareness for fundamental rights among them?
Yeah. Well, like I said, thank you for the question. It starts with the ethical framework. And that's why we and other cities signed the Cities Declaration for Digital Rights. But I also think the report of the FRA presented here is a really huge step in the right way. But even when you try to do the right thing, I have to be honest, that doesn't mean necessarily go right. So that's why I think transparency is very important. It's the only way to perform democratic control, and also, frankly, the only way I can expect our citizens to trust us. And but it's a huge, big concept. So we try to make it very concrete in our city. We've changed our procurement conditions also by demanding specific information from our suppliers. For example, on matters like what data was used to train the AI, but also how bias is prevented, and also what assumptions and decisions were made. We're asking the same level of information from our in-house developers, and we're opening up also this algorithm together with the city of Helsinki. It's called an algorithm register. So we provide information on how algorithms are used by the city and how they impact our citizen personally. So that way it's much easier to hold us accountable also if anything goes wrong. So these are steps I really encourage all governments to take.
I think what is always important for us to keep in the back of our mind is we're not talking about theory here. We're talking about a reality on the ground. And someone who's with us today who actually, sort of challenged that reality on the ground is Anton Ecker. So can you tell us, in your court case, how easy was it for you to get the information necessary about that AI system, how it's working to actually do your job as a lawyer and challenge it in court?
Thank you, Janos. It was very hard. Before we started the case, actually, we tried to gain access through a freedom of information request. And we had to wait for a very long time before the government responded to that. And they didn't even respond to the most basic questions, like how many citizens are involved, or how many cases of fraud have you found. I think actually the government did not have any real overview itself. So that was really puzzling, actually. And even during the court case, the state was reluctant to provide further information about the indicators that were being used and how the system actually worked. And I think in the end, this worked against them very much, because the court could not understand how it worked, the whole system. So transparency is very important. However, we made sure that this case was not just about transparency, because transparency cannot be a justification. Transparency is very important, but also we have to deal, for example, if you look at risk profiling systems, with the purpose limitation principle, because government is linking all kinds of databases to each other without citizens knowing about that. I mean, that's a problem by itself. So, and there's so many more other things, like the whole debate about whether or not these decisions by Siri were in fact automated or not, which is a very complicated debate. I think in practice, we don't know. I mean, there are guidelines, for example, by the ICO in the UK about how meaningful human interference should be interpreted. And this is actually quite a high threshold. I'm doing a case now against Uber. Uber is dismissing Uber drivers automatically with algorithms, and I think there will be a very important test case about how this human interference issue should be interpreted.
And we'll get back to that case later today, but I want to bring Matthias Spielkamp back into the discussion. Matthias.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I wanted to say that I very much agree with what the other panelists said so far about the value also of transparency, but also the limits of transparency. But from what Turia, for example, said, I think it's important to understand. I mean, first of all, I think it was a very, very good decision to create that register of the use of automated decision-making systems or algorithms in the public sector in the city of Amsterdam and Helsinki. We have been asking as an organization for quite a while for such a transparency register that would make mandatory information that about such systems used in the public sector to, first of all, explain what the purpose of these systems are, how they were modeled, but also, very importantly, who developed them. So, for example, were they done by a third party, usually a commercial company that is not part of the public sector itself? Because there we have this entire question of how transparent is it to the users then? And the users are, of course, not the affected, but the users in this case are the public sector, the public administration officials. And again, I agree with much of what has been said, that there is not enough expertise in this system to really understand what is going on. But it's also a fundamental flaw that regulation or legislation here does not provide for high enough incentives to provide that information. Because, for example, if we say we need to have an impact assessment of such a system, and then someone says, okay, so I do an impact assessment, but the way that, for example, the system works and there is a model, a decision-making model employed here, but I can't know what exactly it's doing because the company tells me that this is a trade secret and they can't disclose it to me, then this is all pretty much worthless. And this is, you know, as much as I like, and I would like to state this, that I very much like the report by the Fundamental Rights Agency. It says a lot of good things, but I have two issues with this. And the first one is that there are opinions in there. You know, they are not making recommendations in the sense that recommendations for legislation or demands, but there are opinions in there. And one such opinion says, that the EU and member states should consider targeted actions to support those developing, using, or planning to use AI systems to ensure effective compliance with their fundamental rights impact assessment obligations. Such actions should include, could include funding, guidelines, training, or awareness raising. Fantastic so far. And then it says they should particularly, but not exclusively, target the private sector. And I'm thinking, why is that? You know, why the private sector? Because the public sector is the sector where, you know, people are most affected by, in the sense that they can't escape it. You cannot choose what police you are patrolled by. You cannot choose what welfare system is making decisions about yourself. And then the next thing, and this is my last remark, is that I also have somewhat of an issue that about the transparency question here, that the report says states could consider introducing a legal duty for public administration and private companies using AI systems to provide those seeking redress information about the operation of their AI systems. Very good, but not only for people seeking redress, but for everyone. You know, I'm not talking about disclosing algorithms. I'm not talking about making these data sets publicly available, but we need to have information on a general level, and not only to people seeking redress about how these systems are working, what the purposes are, and these can be disclosed.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to Turia Meliani, who's part of an administration running a city. Something that Matthias Spielkamp just brought up is the notion that companies would tell public administration that they cannot disclose everything about how their systems work. Is that something that you encountered in your work as well?
Well, let me see. I have to leave sorry for the conversation. I'm just waiting, and I have 1 minute to say I want to respond on that. I would like to say to start that we hold freedom and autonomy in very high regard in Amsterdam. So, and we can see that AI for us and working also with a private organization is very important because they have all the innovation. At the same time, we see a lot of difficult things in this part. We can use AI for our benefits, but there is also a need to a level of control. And I don't think it's always simple as keeping a human in the loop and the human in the middle. Everyone needs to understand on one hand how it works, how algorithm works, and in the other to access the outcome. So we need to understand how the algorithms work, especially if they are used in decisions that impact our citizens. So, and the only way is to know how it works is for us transparency, but we're still working I don't know who told about the regulation. I think there should be regulation, and that's why we have to work with other big cities, and that's why we all signed these declarations for digital rights. I think we have still work to do, but we have to innovate at the same time. Else we're totally depending on the public sector, and on the other hand, we want to make it sure that our citizens have social benefits, that they have to get the social benefits. So it works two ways. I think we have still work to do, but I think the human, everyone should be in the middle of everything we do, and that means also to include even artists to think about. And I think everything is in design. So we have some steps to make, but I think we can all work together in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Turia Meliani. And I want to go from sort of the level of local politics to European politics and back to Olivier Onidi in Brussels. So what role does the European Commission as the EU's executive branch play in all of this?
Thank you. Well, first let me say that I like actually the discussion so far. All too often, when you start a conversation on artificial intelligence, face recognition, whatever, the conversation is about yes or no. And here I think that is the remarkable part. No one is trying, to neglect the fact that in our society we need better tools to make better decisions. Now the question is how to use these tools to, in effect, be sure that the decision ultimately that is being made is actually qualitatively better than without using a tool. So at European level, what do? First, we try to promote the digitalization of our societies, to promote a responsible way of digitalizing our societies, because we see first that if we don't promote and support our own European actors, we will actually end up using systems, solutions that would have been developed outside. And when I take, for example, facial recognition, we know how effective some countries that do not have the same democratic requirements as us are pushing the very swift deployment of facial recognition, using all sorts of aspects that actually embed very strong error rates at the end, because just simply there is absolutely no transparency, no impact assessment, no framework also in order to develop that according to ground principles. So what we try to do, if I take maybe the law enforcement aspect, your first question. First, we don't monitor 100% of what is being done, but we see that artificial intelligence has become an important aspect for all law enforcement authorities in the EU, for the reasons I described early on. So we will early next year come, and that's, I think, that contributes to the first principle of transparency, with a policy document whereby we will try to describe but also assess what type of artificial intelligence is being used in the law enforcement community, the police, the border guards, etc., and also how these developments have actually happened. What is the framework around in order to have also somewhat of an assessment whether the current European framework is still ripe, or whether we need to adjust a number of things, and also to see at national level the process throughout which these tools have been developed, and then the conditions that surround their use. Definitely, this idea of fundamental rights impact assessment is what I would say a must-have. You see, even in European initiatives, more and more, when there are fundamental rights aspects concerned, we actually not only come with an impact assessment of a general nature, but we come with a specific fundamental rights impact assessment. This was the case when we proposed the revamp of our information systems that are being used at the borders by the police, where you have very sensitive information. This was the case also last week when we presented the new proposal of the legal base for Europol, in order to there as well assess better the conditions under which Europol could actually use personal and private data. So this needs to become, I would say, like a general principle that should apply certainly when we talk about artificial intelligence. And then we need also to have an additional third layer, which is like a regular review, because we see at what pace this technology is evolving. We see also at what pace the use is deploying, and very often we see that what has been actually the conditions under which something has been launched is very often quickly outdated. So I think this regular review in all sectors allows also to feed in the lessons learned from the users, the lessons learned from also the public. we are talking about the activities in the public domain, which will help, I think, to constantly review and adjust the conditions in order to ensure a responsible use of these technologies.
Thank you. We have questions from the audience, and I would like to read out one question that was submitted by Karian Melchior, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Renew Europe group. Maybe that's a good question for you to answer, Anton. Karen Melchior is asking, with regard to social welfare, it depends on process, depends on what kind of decision, and depends if people will be competent to contradict the computer if it says no, and they believe no, yes. How can we regulate to ensure that humans have time, competence, and empowerment to ensure correct decisions? So to paraphrase, what is needed so that people actually understand that their fundamental rights could be breached in that process? And maybe you can also tell us a bit about those people that you represented during your case. Were they aware that their fundamental rights were breached in the process?
Well, to start with the first point, it was very hard to find anybody actually that was affected by the Siri system, because nobody was aware of it. So we didn't act on behalf of any individual claimants. We acted on behalf of privacy organizations. So how can we make sure that people make the good decisions or have the knowledge? I think there's a very interesting report by ICO, which states what requirements should be met to make sure that there is some kind of human interference. Well, and when we look at how to inform people, yeah, well, that's a very hard question. I don't have an answer to that right now. I think we have the legal framework, which is basically GDPR, but there should be standards for that from sector to sector, probably. One important aspect, by the way, is, which has not been mentioned, I think, is that you can have all the nice procedural safeguards, but if the data is not reliable, which was the case in the Siri case, we have the garbage in, garbage out situation. So if the data is wrong, any results from an algorithm will be unreliable. And I think that's also a big issue for government databases, depending on what database you're using, of course.
Over to Mireille Hildebrand, who I believe was raising her hand.
Yes, very practical about registers. So registers for algorithms or software or whatever which nice label we want to use. Very practically, I would like to have 3 things at least in every register for every algorithm, software, or AI application. So first, what does this application claim to do? And that should be related to the purpose for which it's going to be used. So what does it claim to do? Second, how is this claim substantiated? By whom? Is it by the person selling it? Hugely interesting, but when I want to know something about a certain brand of toothpaste, I'm not going to ask them how well it works. So third, I want to see at least the amount and the type of NDAs in the contract between public administration and a private company.
An NDA is a non-disclosure agreement.
Sorry, yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I think that it would be nice if we would find a way to make that concrete. So just to say, well, there are 48 non-disclosure agreements in this contract, or 3, doesn't mean very much. I do understand that sometimes we need NDAs, but then I want to know what type, what is hidden, what is the reason. And we all know that the Data Protection Authority supervisor, because of the GDPR, will have access to that. So they will be able to check. So I want to offer the opacity that we need, but not more than that. And I also want to know whether the stuff works, because, well.
I believe Matthias Spielkamp felt like he wanted to say something, and I want to include a question that came from the audience, because my feeling is you have an opinion on that too. Sort of like on a more positive note, how can AI also be used to guarantee and protect human rights? For example, by analyzing decision-making and policy consequences to detect discriminatory biases and effects. It was asked by Antti Hellin from the Ministry of Finance in Finland.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think everyone would agree that it can be used for this, but we're coming back to this question of what exactly is AI, you know? So yeah, if we use tools to analyze, for example, if there is a certain bias in a database, is that already an application of what we're talking about? Maybe, you know, but it depends then on the concrete case again. So I think there are lots of tools, and there will be others in the future. And it's a little like, you know, 21 or 22 years ago, we called the program that won against Garry Kasparov in chess, artificial intelligence, and nowadays we would call it a chess computer. That maybe, you know, with the same power runs on our smartphones. So it's a little hard to answer these questions. Can AI be used for this or that? Because we don't really know what we're talking about. So yeah, collecting data and analyzing data can be used for good purposes. I think that's the case. And then we have to look at what exactly we are talking about. But I would like to come back to Karen Melchior's question and the attempts to answer this. You know, how can we ensure that, for example, there are in these practicalities, there are people who are competent, that have the expertise, and so on and so forth. And there, I think we do need some legislation, actually, in the sense that we need to set down in law that there needs to be this reflective process of finding out or answering the questions, for example, that Mireille posed. You know, what does the system claim it can achieve? How is this substantiated? Now, if you are required to answer these questions, then I would at least hope that the expertise has to come with it. Because if you can't answer these questions, you can't actually fulfill the obligations that would then ideally be in law. And therefore, the whole thing needs to develop. So you can't just say, well, you know, we looked at it, we don't really have an idea, but the vendors tell us that everything is fine. This is not going to cut it anymore. So this is at least what we hope at Algorithm Watch, what could be happening, that if we have such transparency requirements, then this would mandate this reflective process that is needed to understand this and to also build this expertise that is needed to govern these systems better.
Mm-hmm. And just to sort of to support your point about the difficulty of defining what AI is, the Fundamental Rights Agency, one of the responses they received for their report when they interviewed a private company was that they said, like, we couldn't find a single lawyer all across Europe who could tell us what artificial intelligence actually is. I don't know if they called you, Anton, but apart from that, I want to ask a question from the audience. And I think, Olivier, maybe you would be a good person to give your insights into that. Karsten Orwart is asking, who should develop the standards for those fundamental rights impact assessments that we already spoke about? Should it be human rights authorities? Should it be standardization bodies, or who should it be?
Thank you. Well, I think, I mean, the Fundamental Rights Agency has definitely a role to play in this. Definitely when we conduct fundamental rights impact assessments, we have the support of the Fundamental Rights Agency. And if the agency, it was very well explained early on, is not an agency that can, that provides standards or accreditation. It is definitely there to provide guidance, guidelines even. And I think if you embark into a field such as what are the main criteria, etc., you would like to use or you would like to see in a fundamental rights impact assessment, you definitely can get a lot from a body like the Fundamental Rights Agency. On the, if I may, just on the previous issue, that like some of the major positives of the power of the computer, I would say, because if we don't call it the artificial intelligence, I think the first one, which should not be underestimated, human creatures are full of biases. And if you don't, and if we should not leave a decision to a machine, the computer can definitely help you to correct some of the biases you have inherently because of your history, because of your education, because of plenty of aspects. So let us not underestimate as well the power of computers to help you, to support you, to bring more objectivity in the decisions that are being taken. I mean, some of the systems we are using, for example, at borders, do regularly analyze the way border guards actually check individuals at the borders and provide feedback as to some of the recurrent biases that have been detected towards certain categories of individuals that were at the borders. The second, it improves also the quality of the data. Many have said, you know, one of the fundamental problem and the weakness of this artificial intelligence construction is, of course, the quality of the data. Well, the artificial intelligence also is being used to regularly review data sets and put on the side some data that is being seen as not complete enough or leading to too many false negatives, etc., etc. This is what is being done by our agency that is constantly looking at the set of data that is being used in all the information systems of the EU. Again, in order to provide a better assurance that the data sometimes that leads to someone stopping you in the street or stopping you at the border and putting you and making you subject to secondary checks, etc., is actually clean and of good quality. The third one is that the algorithms have actually the power also to correct themselves, not automatically, of course, but they can point at also some deficiencies or some weaknesses, inherent weaknesses. I take the example of the passenger name record system. You know, each time you travel by air, some data is being pushed to the authorities on the other side. And there as well, regularly, the rules that are being used in order to cross some of these data in order to find some leads is regularly being reviewed also by the computers in order to minimize or progressively limit the number of false negatives. So let us also not underestimate the power of the machine to improve. And again, for me, all this is there to help the ultimate decision-making process and the ultimate decision being made. But of course, it needs to be subject to quite a number of conditions which we have discussed also. Thank you.
I want to go back to Anton Ecker for a second, because you hinted at it already. We talked about your Siri case. That is concluded. Now you're onto a new case, which involves Uber drivers. What's that about?
So it's about two things. Basically, first of all, drivers want to have access to their data, like all the data that is being processed on the Uber platform, which is, of course, a lot of data, not only about rides, but also ratings and all other kinds of profiles, for example, that Uber handles. And then secondly, a number of Uber drivers that I'm representing are challenging automated dismissals by Uber. because Uber uses algorithms to decide whether or not you have committed fraud. And if they think you are fraud, you receive a message in the driver app, which simply states that you have been deactivated because you have committed fraud. But these messages do not contain any explanation about this fraud, and you don't get any possibility to respond. You're just immediately activated, and that's it. So of course that's has a very big impact on my clients, and I've started a case on that. We'll have to see how the court looks at that.
But, and I mean, you know, how, because this brings us right back to what we talked about earlier. I mean, how easy or difficult is it to get the information that's necessary for you to challenge Uber in court?
It's very hard, very hard. You know, Uber is an American company, and their whole business model, I think, is based on opacity. They don't want to share information. So then this American business model is confronted with European style privacy legislation. That's the whole, collision that we're seeing here right now. So it's going to be very interesting. Also, because I think this is the first time a court will decide on automated decisions like this. And I've also, included a claim for damages. So it will be interesting to see.
And we will follow it. We are almost towards at the end of our discussion. So this gives you sort of like a last chance to give a final comment. It has to be below 1 minute because we're really close to the end. Mireille, is there something you would like to add? I believe your microphone is turned off.
Okay, sorry. I think it would be great if we focus on using ML itself to support
machine learning.
Yes, machine learning itself to support fundamental rights. And there, I want to point out that in the research domain of machine learning, if you want to introduce correction mechanisms or checking or monitoring on things like human bias, on things like transparency, equality, non-discrimination, and privacy, then you have to help the machine because it needs a proxy. It cannot see what you mean. So you need to give it proxies. And the surprise is if after you've given it proxies, it's going to base everything on that proxy. And if that proxy, which has to be disambiguated, otherwise the machine does not hear you, that means everything that you have disambiguated away becomes for the machine invisible. And that makes it very difficult to use it for this, though I have great hopes, of course.
Thank you. What about you, Olivier? Do you have great hopes?
No, I definitely have great hope. You understood it, like in terms of the opportunity to better use these tools. I'd like also to refer to what just Anton said. We have, I believe, quite a solid framework to protect fundamental rights on this side of the world. We're very proud of this. We're very attached to this, and I hope the fact that we are digitalizing, that we aim for more use of tools such as artificial intelligence will actually conduct us to even further strengthen this. And in that respect, I note at least the two recipes that Mireille gave us, like Matthias, I like very much the fact that you should disclose what does this claim to do when you actually use the power of machines, and also to have a demonstration and substantiate the way you believe that this machine will actually help to achieve those objectives. I think that those two could be like principles we could embed into a legislation that for use by the public sector, but also first and foremost also the private sector. Thank you.
Matthias, one final thought.
Yeah, I try to put a big one in very little time. So we are trying to demystify artificial intelligence and all this at Algorithm Watch. And this also includes not to have too high hopes, because this is technology, and we need to understand what the technology can do and what it cannot do and what we can best use it for. But what we also need to keep in our view, and this was not part of the discussion here, but in the chat, as I saw, is that it's not enough to look at AI and ADM in isolation. And no one here is doing this, but it was just not really said in the discussion that when we have discriminatory practices in, let's say, real life, they will be just repeated using artificial intelligence or whatnot, or computers. And this is what we also need to address. But this is, of course, a much, much bigger question.
Context is key. Thank you to all panelists for what turned out to be a really fascinating discussion. And Anton Ecker's next case illustrated it already. The use of AI by the public sector is one field, but another one, it's just one part of the picture. Another important field is the use of AI by private corporations who use it to automate decisions over their customers or employees. And that's exactly what we will discuss this afternoon when we return from our well-deserved lunch break. There's one last note before I let you go. While we're having a break now, you'll be hearing some music, and I would encourage you to take a close listen, because what you're hearing is a track that was composed entirely by an AI system, an AI software called AIVA. And if you like what you hear, you can find out more information about the project on the conference website. And now, before I let you go, let's have another final look at the graphic recording by our illustrator, our conference illustrator, Gabriele Heinzel. And I'll see you again when the conference continues here at 2 p.m.